And I'll quickly explore the different types of printed propaganda intended for the intended audience and the subjects that the Imperial Japanese used during the war. I've got three themes I'll be talking about today. One is the driving charge to Singapore. The reason why I've added that is because I see it as a bookend. You've got the start of the story and then you've got the end of the story on like February 15th, 1942, and the start being 8th of February. So to me, that's why I've added a start and then the end part. The second part is about how the Japanese are commemorated and celebrated the fall of Singapore, covering civilians, covering the military, like who they captured during the conflict. And I've got some of the people and places which they recorded during the time of the occupation here, during 1942 to 45. So getting on to what we're doing today, the Imperial Japanese, a conquest of Malaya and Singapore in early 1942, was a globally significant event with far-reaching ramifications. To impress upon the subjects of their newly seized lands, as well as upon their own people and the world that they were invincible, the Japanese military created a diverse range of wartime propaganda. Some of the most easily mass-produced and popular forms of propaganda were souvenir postcards, posters, prints and magazines, which included images and artworks featuring the local people, the places and the battles. And that's what I've got mainly down here to the front here, and that's what today's talk is about. So this short presentation will highlight some of these rarely seen images, not just in Japan or in Australia, but also in Singapore. They had a system of war artists go and record their victories through the South Pacific, going all the way from like China, of course, down through Malaya, across to Borneo, to New Guinea, and to the Solomon Islands, and to my own country. This is a really big deal for the Japanese Navy, was their defeat of the Royal Navy off the coast of Kuantan on the 10th of December 1941. They sunk two major British capital ships. One is the Repulse, which was an old First World War sort of vessel, but the big one was the Prince of Wales, which only a few months earlier, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill met on to sign the agreement to link America and Britain together. So it's a really important ship, and it was a new battleship which was sunk. Now, for the Japanese Navy, if you don't know, I'll make it real quick, they looked up to the Royal Navy for decades. When they looked at how to form a navy after they become brought into the 19th century by the Americans, they looked to the British, a similar country, small islands, big population. How do they own such a big empire? Their navy. So for the Japanese, many of them saw their defeat of the Royal Navy in this campaign as being almost the student defeating the master. That's what a Japanese friend described it to me as being. And you've got various postcards here, posters and images. This is a board game, funnily enough, which was done during the war. But you've got all types of... So they really looked at this as being a major, and it was a significant victory for them. It was the first time ever any ship had been sunk, major ship sunk by purely air attacks in the open sea. These two talk about the driving charge still as they're coming down the Malay Peninsula. Night attack in the rain. So this is the Japanese using tanks in the night, in the rain, to burst their way through the British Indian Army as they're north of Penang. And then the Slim River, of course, is between here and KL, and that's them advancing southwards towards Singapore. Again, the one on the right is by an official army war artist. This one here was part of a series of artworks which were done in 1943. So this is all to commemorate what happened last year in their victories in 1942. This is from the same series, exact same edition. 23 Sea Eagles, aerial onslaught over Singapore. So you've got them shooting their Navy aircraft here, shooting down British, you can see the red, white and blue circles, British aeroplanes. Now, I'm an aeroplane nerd, and I look at this right away and I go, that's an aeroplane that was never here. This is a Spitfire, which is a famous British aeroplane. So they've got the wrong aeroplane fighting over Singapore. Now, I believe this would be because the Spitfire was a really famous aeroplane in World War II. And everyone knew about, a year before this, over Britain, the Battle of Britain, where they were outnumbered, the British, but they still beat many more German bombers coming into Britain. So I think that they've just picked up an aeroplane on a Spitfire, yep, being shot down, yeah. So that's why I think they may have added the Spitfire and not put the realistic aeroplanes, of which we had 2 fighter plane types that flew over Singapore during the war. But I think because it makes them look better shooting down the world's best, almost most famous fighter plane, the Spitfire over Singapore. This one is like Japanese forces landing up at Sarambam Beach, northwest Singapore in 1942. So this is Australian 22nd Brigade taking on the Imperial Japanese. Now, this one is accurate. The way they actually depict the equipment, the helmets, the uniforms, the searchlights being used. You've got machine gun fire, cannons coming in and so forth. And it depicts them, if you look at the way this is done, it's an upward struggle. And these men are forcibly grabbing onto vines, getting torn and ripped by the mangroves as they get up and onto the island of Singapore. So this sort of shows people that it wasn't just a walkover. Singapore wasn't just a simple, yeah, we just walked over the causeway and we captured it. This showed people back home that they actually did fight here. And as you may or may not know, they lost hundreds of soldiers coming across that short moat you have around Singapore during the war. So this one was part of a series, again published in 1943, a year after this battle, to depict their victories in 1942. Meeting of General Yamashita and General Percival by Saburo Miyamoto of the Malaya Dispatch Force, authorised by the Ministry of Army. So he's one of the official war artists. Now, we have in Canberra the actual surrender table, which was given to Australia in 1963 by the Ford Motor Company. So Ford America gave that table to Australia. And that table came here about 2 years ago or so to celebrate a really important thing, SG50. And for Australia, it actually meant a lot because we were the first nation to officially recognise the Young Republic as being a full nation. So we actually loaned this table for the first time back to Singapore. So you could see the table here. In real life, the photos you see of this actual going down, there was no Japanese dictionary here, big fat dictionary. There was no white surrender flag hanging in the background or Union Jack. They were not there in the corner. The way this artist did this artwork is he's elevated the Japanese side, led by General Yamashita, above the British. And he's got them looking up and down at the British. It's part of the style for the image. But you need to go check the real thing out. You can't beat that. Look, this is just a photocopy. Now, this is what they were making by the 1,000 to give to soldiers to send home. So this is one reason why I did the talk today. These little bits of propaganda and their victories were being in like the pockets of soldiers. In our collection at the War Memorial, we've got handfuls of these postcards in our collection taken off dead Japanese soldiers all through the Pacific. And so we've got examples of these and so forth. And this is this one here I've got over here as well. These are some of the people and places in occupied Singapore which we've got here today as well. So these will all be talked about in a minute. This is about these ones here are about the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And so you've got children of East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere play together under the rising sun flag. You've got South Pacific Islanders, you've got Chinese, Malays, Indians and so forth, all these children. This one here has got also the flag of Manchukuo, which is Manchuria, occupied China, Bright Future of Asia. And this one here I've got as well in the collection, which is Papua New Guineans, South Pacific Islanders, Chinese, Indians, all types of people here celebrating with the Japanese, a heart to protect the Japanese flag by this artist here. And the top one is Southern Hinamaru Village, so Southern Rising Sun Village by this artist. And I'm not quite sure of this location yet. But again, I may get told by one of my colleagues who can help me out, or someone here maybe. But there's some examples of other postcards that these people were being given to write back home with, back to the home islands, or to Korea, or to Taiwan. Not every single Japanese soldier here, of course, was from mainland China. Many thousands were from other parts of occupied Asia. We have for many years had thousands of Japanese tourists come through the War Memorial in Canberra. Many of them are surprised. I've had Japanese friends. When I was at university, I did a museum studies degree, and we had some international students from Japan co-located with us, and they said to me, "So where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to go to the War Museum to go check it out because I want to work there one day." And so I said, "Can we come along?" I said, "Come along, it's free." We then go to World War II gallery, and we had back then a huge Japanese flag next to the German Nazi flag, and they just went, they were quite stunned. And they said, "Okay, what's this got, why are you showing Japan in your war museum?" And I said, "Well, if you go around the corner, you'll see some more stuff." And they got to see, and they were just like, they were literally like hands over their mouth, looking at things going, "I had no idea." And they actually were apologising to me. She goes, "For me, as a girl, back in Tokyo, I knew of a little bit about a war in China. America had forced us to go to war. We had to attack Pearl Harbor to defend ourselves. And then in 1945, 2 atom bombs hit Japan." Very much so. The fall of Singapore was their biggest ever victory. Their most significant victory of World War II was this island falling. And what it meant was like a major military defeat, a political defeat on every level. It was a game changer, and that's one reason why as a student of this conflict, I'm amazed at the number of Singaporeans who don't know about their own island and how much of a pivot point it was. Singapore was a pivot point, and you guys were one of them. And it's a big deal. And during the war, whilst they were winning, they loved to bring out the Singapore stuff and say, "Look, this is what's happening in Singapore. We are making people learn Japanese. We're getting them as part of the world, as part of our regime." So the fall of Singapore was a major event, for many countries. I've got down here as well some Italian World War II propaganda, which depicts the fall of Singapore. So this just shows you that the Germans, the Italians were seeing what was going on, and it was making the front page of news in Berlin and Italy during the war. And their depictions of what they were hearing and seeing about like the Ford factory and the fall of Singapore and the civilians. So it was a major, huge event. They really plugged it for all it was worth, and they should have, and they did, because it was a big victory.